And this is the second of the VidCast on kinship. Thought I'd just start off with a set of images. This image is from the Purple City, the Forbidden City in Beijing, and it's there's an enormous, round, very spectacular temple north of the main sort of residential section, and this is the function of the temple is the ancestral temple. So in the Qing dynasty, since it's Qing capital, the emperor would come here, and these are the tablets of the ancestors of the emperor. Now, as the emperors would change, there's another part of this to one side. So what would happen is as the emperor comes to power, of course, the relationships would change a little bit in terms of which of the ancestors there are. And so some of these folks would get moved off over to the side, other related family, and new members, past members of the family would be put in this central position of authority. So this gives you an idea of the image, of the importance of family, of clan, even in the imperial system, despite the fact they played games with it a lot. The reality was this people's power and authority was entirely based on who they were the descendants of, in the sense of the clan. And so this is one of the most important buildings in the whole, imperial capital, even though it doesn't, well, they Chinese that go there understand, but I think foreigners that go there don't really understand the function of this place, not surprisingly. This is one of my favorite places, Walking Hot Springs in Xi'an. Um, and just as a quick sort of a historical note, Walking Hot Springs, actually it's a hot springs. It's to the it's in the southeast corner of Xi'an. It's actually not too far from the Qin Huangdi's mausoleum. So it's on this. It was on the outside of town, if you were. It's actually in the edges of what used to be called Xianjiang, which is the really old pre-Chang'an capital. And so this hot spring's been around for ages. I'm sure it's been popular for thousands of years. Anyways, by the Tang Dynasty, in fact, before that, but certainly by the Tang Dynasty, a whole complex. It was basically a resort. It was a whole complex of buildings, beautifully done, for the purposes of the imperial family or free elites, but especially the imperial family, to hang around, soak in the hot water, and basically have a good old time. So it was a classic spa resort, except in this case for the most elites of the elites. And the classic story goes, I can never remember if he's the third or fourth. Anyways, one of the Tang emperors is up there, having a good time. And as per the imperial system, you had an enormous number of wives and concubines. The wives were there to give you formal children. So that's a classic, husband and wife thing. Concubines were there to give you children also. And the rather practical view from the Chinese standard was if the concubine can give you a son and your wives can't, then you basically sort of make the concubine into a wife, and then the son now becomes, your next generation. So it's a really sort of practical Chinese way to make sure that you end up with sons one way or the other if you've got the power and the authority. Concubinage, and now they're called mistresses, they're actually still quite common in China. So it's still status and prestige, anyways. So the emperor's out here, having a bath, soaking, and one of the concubines wants to catch his attention, which is really hard because I think he had like 70 prospective concubines. And so what she does is she sort of accidentally forgets he's there and sort of accidentally undresses in front of him and sort of does this whole da 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 da. And of course, it gets his attention, and then they become, buddies, if you would. And eventually she becomes the head mistress. This is the famous Lady Yang. Considered the Chinese have this list of what they call the 5 most beautiful women ever in China, and she's one of the 5. So she's the concubine of the, emperor in Tang China in this period of time. And so she eventually comes to authority, and she becomes the stereotype of the bad woman. Not that she's bad personally, but she She gets rid of any competition. She whispers into her husband's ears and has them execute folks that she thinks are going to be competition. She makes sure that especially her brothers and her brothers and nephews, I can't remember who, end up in positions of authority. And she basically makes a mess of the empire, all to promote her family of birth over the goods of both the empire and, of course, also by extension, the good intent of the empire as the emperor. But it also points out then that guys are invariably fallible because whatever she wants, the emperor gives her. I'll let you go. You can go Google this if you want to hear. She got a fascinating story, and even in the ending punchline is fantastic. Anywho's, ever since then, this walking hot springs, which is where this occurred, has become a real hot spot in Chinese sort of folklore, mythology. God knows how many sort of historical soap operas have been generated by this. And so this statue, if you would, is theoretically of Lady Yang, though she didn't look anything like that. Chinese classical beauty didn't look like this. This is very much what I call a Euro-American cute lady. She had a real different build from the pictures we have of her. So, anywho's, so the hot spring stays around till I think the 19th century. Then it gets burned down or destroyed. Anyways, it disappears. It gets rebuilt in the 1930s, and then rebuilt again in the 1950s or 1960s. And they tried, and they did a beautiful job. They basically made it a reconstruction of the Tang Dynasty or large parts of the Tang Dynasty complex. So what you see behind us here is there's actually hot water spouting out of dragon spouts back here. So this whole thing is floating, if you would, shrouded by a pool of hot water. And so the statue is placed in front of this. Now, one of this is so it's so practically Chinese. It's so symbolic in so many ways. What you can see over here is a little sort of booth. What they're selling is little medicine cups of hot spring water. Now, it's not toxic. I didn't try one. Nancy tried it. But what you can do is you can also buy in bottles. And the attitude the Chinese have is that, I'm not sure if anyone actually totally believes it, but all these people are only enough to buy it. Is that if you have this and you ingest it, then you can get some of the beauty of Lady Yang. And it also, it's supposed to be sort of like an aphrodisiac, I think. I don't know. The lady who was running the thing was not happy that we were asking questions, and I was having such a hard time not laughing at part of it, and especially because these folks are totally serious buying this stuff, so you got to be really careful. You don't want to piss people off. So they do a huge business in selling little things of water. But the other thing that is even more fascinating is according to a guard, one of the Laoban who was over here that we were talking story with, he was, in fact, that might be him there. We were asking him about the statue because I said, the statue doesn't look very Chinese. And he sort of laughed. He said, no, it's, some foreigner had the statue made in China and then that they put it there. But he said, what's really a trip and what no one had figured on, and of course, by this he means the folks that run the springs now, is if you notice this thing's only at this point was probably 45 years old, the statue was. If you notice, it's looked pretty worn. And the reason was from the minute they put the statue up is people wanted to not only be posed next to it, but especially women, but also guys, he was sort of rolling his eyes at this, but especially women wanted to touch the statue. So in the same way that a lot of folks sort of seemed that the water had, if you would, magical power, mana, or the Chinese would call it qi, they also thought that the statue would have qi. So what you do is, if you're Chinese and you're a tourist and you're female, is these ladies they're all part of a tour group, I think, is they're all going up here and taking turns holding on to part of the statue and having their picture taken, with the idea that somehow part of the essence of what made Lady Yang what it was will end up in her or end up in these folks. I'm not sure, you can never tell people actually believe this or not. It's Chinese, again, are on one hand, Chinese are really practical, but one of the weird sides of being practical is if you're not sure about something, then why wouldn't you do it? I bet that maybe 60% of these ladies aren't sure if this is true and maybe think it's probably bullshit. But on the other hand, what the hell you got to lose, right? It can't do anything bad. No one's ever said anything bad happens. And if it touches and something good happens, that's cool. You already paid for it when you paid admission to the hot spring. So what the hell? But what's fascinating is this has become its own attraction. And then the Lao Ban was just rolling his eyes. The guard was just rolling his eyes. So like, no one ever thought this was going to happen. Especially like I told him, I made the mistake of saying, it doesn't even look like her. And he just started laughing. He said, yeah, there's all sorts of pictures, images around here being at the hot springs of what she actually looked like. She had the typical Tang Dynasty round face. She was a little more chubby, built entirely differently. But hey, it is what it is. So, but again, this is idea of the woman. To a certain extent, I think in American or European literature, they talk about the other woman. You'd have to ask one of the English folks. But in Chinese society, this is sort of women are always sort of going to be the other woman. And Lady Yang is the personification of the other woman, manipulative, beautiful, incredibly clever. But the end result was that she almost brought down an entire dynasty by virtue of her clan-oriented, very quote selfish unquote motives and behavior. And this is one of the coolest. We saw this in Beijing. It's actually on the way to the Forbidden City. Well, there's a long processional pathway. You can see the edge of it here that leads up to that temple I was telling you about with the tablets in it. And there was this guy. Now he's got a little plastic bag full of hot water. And what he's doing, he's riding the water on this pavement. Now it's about, I don't know, maybe 20 degrees out. So the minute that water hits the pavement, it freezes up. So these characters are ice. They're frozen water. Now, I thought initially what he was doing was just calligraphy, because this is a very sophisticated, very scholarly form of calligraphy. You have to remember in all of Asia, but especially in China, calligraphy is an art form. People spend years learning how to write well, and you can actually get a promotion or a better job based on your calligraphy. So, being able to write like this is a real sign of sophistication and style. But this guy was going a step further. I couldn't figure it out because you can't really see him in the picture, the way I cropped the picture, but there's a bunch of folks standing around here watching him. Now, I thought originally they were watching him to see how he did the calligraphy, but they weren't. What he's doing is he's writing a poem. Now, I don't know what this one was. I never did figure it out. My sister-in-law, I figured out this one was actually one of Li Bo's poems. And so what he did is he writes about half of the poem and then he stops. So he's probably going to stop here with this character because this is the other part of it, of the other poem. And what everyone's going to do is they're going to look at this, and it's a game. And what they're going to try to do is by figuring out the first part of the poem, they have to recognize the poem and then say out loud what the last part is. So you have to finish the poem. So I suppose it's sort of like, the closest thing I can think of, maybe I think that like Jeopardy or something like a game show in the United States. Now, this gets into what we're going to look at in this one, which is individuality. I don't know who this guy is. I don't know what he is. But I can guarantee that he has a lot of status and prestige because he's displaying in public both his superb scholarly nature by virtue of this beautiful calligraphy he's doing, and also by virtue of knowing these things by heart so that he can take a part of them, write them out, and he knows obviously the rest of it. And the trick is what you want to do is this was sort of, I think you might have just started with this one because everyone knows Li Bo's poetry. Neither my sister-in-law, she's a professional translator, neither she nor I could recognize what this poem was. It could be anywhere from the last 2,000 years of Chinese history. But it's probably from the Tang Dynasty or maybe the Wei Dynasty or maybe the Song, though I started to doubt it. Anyways, it's an old poem. So what he's doing is he's displaying his skill and aptitude and mastery. Now, if you think about it, this is about as individualistic as you can get. This is individual performance. He's putting his calligraphy on the line for everyone else to see. And people won't be shy. They won't necessarily say anything. It's not like an American site where people would make a lot of noise, but the way they roll their eyes, or whether they watch it, or whether they just sort of shake their heads and walk away, they're going to make a statement about whether they think this is any good or not. And secondly, the number of people that he stumps or start talking to each other to try to figure out what the poem was. We ended up talking to two guys next to us trying to figure out what the rest of the poem is. They didn't know what it was either. So strangers will communicate, which is very rare in Chinese society, because of this. So this is to me, this is a classically Chinese case of individualism. He's got a tremendously high aptitude skill set. He's displaying this in the capital, Beijing. He's displaying this at the imperial capital and the imperial center of the Forbidden City, the Purple City, on the way that leads from the palaces to the ancestral temple. That's about as obvious. That's about as public and obvious a place you can get for someone who's supposed to have style and sophistication, even in modern China. So this guy's making a statement. Now, if you ask him who he is, he's going to tell you his last name. His family might be merchants. I don't know. They might own a shop. They might own a store. They might own a restaurant. I don't know. They might be government officials. Who knows? He's gaining prestige for the family by virtue of showing this aptitude and skill in public, because to a certain extent, he's not an individual. Yeah, he is an individual. He's the one that did it. He learned it himself. But on the other hand, the fact that his family encouraged that and that he's got this level of skill shows how important and how powerful and how successful his family is. The only thing I can think of in American society would be this is a team effort, if you want to think of it. He's the front pace of the team, but the team made this possible. And this is a really important thing to understand in Chinese society. Chinese can be very individualistic in the sense that they can become many of them, they're very, very driven. Compared to Americans, I'd say most Chinese are very driven. But they're not necessarily going to be focused on making money. In China, again, think of gossip. People are going to gossip about this guy. Now, they're not going to gossip in a bad way. People were taking all sorts of texting pictures and sending them on Weibo and all the other platforms. God knows how many TikToks are probably of this guy, of him doing this. And even if people don't know who he is, those that do are going to say, oh, yeah, I know who that guy is. He's da-da-da-da-da-da. His last name's Joe or something like that. And so what happens is individualism in China means that you enhance family prestige. Your job as an individual is to make the family look good. You can do that by being financially successful. You can do that in his case by being a very sophisticated literary artist. Whatever you're good at, you should be as good as you potentially possibly can be, because that's going to enhance what the family gets out of it. So Chinese aren't necessarily told, oh, you're going to have to take over the family business. But they are going to be told you had better be as good as you can possibly manage to be at whatever it is you're going to be good at, because that's how the family's going to get a better reputation. And what you do not do is get involved in stuff that would have people TikToking, say, if you misspelled stuff and it was real sloppy and he looked like he was all screwed up, then people are going to do the same TikToks, but they're going to be dissing on him. And what you don't want is the family finding out that you're doing stuff and other people are laughing at it, because they're not laughing at you as an individual. They're laughing at the family. Now, if you think about this, is totally different than the way that Americans use Instagram, TikTok, and the other social media platforms where influencers do all sorts of stupid shit constantly just to get notoriety. And Chinese don't understand that. I know I've had these discussions at dinner where the families are like, since I'm the holy of the group, why do people do that? I mean, they see it and they understand it, but they don't understand why. And I'm like, I can't help. I come from a clan system. To me, it doesn't make any sense either. And I've already seen this, here. I saw it back in Hawaii all the time, especially with visitors, but I see it here a lot in Nevada too. People do stupid shit because they want to be noticed. In China, you don't do stupid shit to be noticed, because what's going to get noticed is your family. And God knows the senior members of the family are going to come down you like a ton of bricks. And so individualism in China is within the context that you have to maximize your potential not to get an ego boost as an individual, but to give the family, if you would, an ego boost, a reputation boost. So it can look superficially the same, but the motivations, I would argue, are just about totally different. Okay, so that gets to the role of individual. As I mentioned before, morality is an interesting thing in Chinese society because morality is based more on social perception of what's the right thing to do. And that still, even today in the communist system, boils down to Confucian morality. Confucian morality is based on the idea of the group. It's based on the idea of the clan. You always do what's good for the clan. By extension, you do what's good for the country or what's good for the, for Han China or whatever. By extension, but the key here is that it's not like the Ten Commandments. It's not like a written down set of rules that apply all the time. And this is important to remember. This is not true just of Asian societies, also very true of Pacific Island societies like Hawaiian society. These are societies which are ruled by situational morality. So in American society, I would say more than any other society I know, we're driven by what I'd call fixed morality. There's the religious structure. There's also all the other laws and such that make up, how you're supposed to behave and what's going to happen if you don't. And those are all written and they apply all the time. Equal under the law. Classic American image. No one in Asia and no one in the Pacific traditionally would understand what that meant. In Asian societies, everything's situational. Based on that particular situation, that's how the morality is interpreted. It's not universal. Thou shalt be a good person. I don't know, that's not quite one of the Ten Commandments, but that in Asian societies, that everyone would sort of like, well, in this situation, that's this. In another situation, it might be the exact opposite. So you're not going to, the idea of theft, for example, is going to be situational. So in that, people are going to be judged on the way that the group, by the general population, sees the way they behave. If it's situationally good, then that's a good moral thing to do. If it's situationally bad, then it was a bad moral thing to do. And it's not. And if it's a bad moral thing, it doesn't make any difference if you follow the quote letter of the law. That's what I'm saying. The classic American is letter of the law. Chinese, in fact, in all of Asia, this is also true, certainly in Asia, people could give a rat's ass about the letter of the law. This is something that constantly causes trouble for Americans. For example, I've heard stories of Americans in Japan that do stupid stuff, especially as tourists, and get arrested for something. And they try to bring in a lawyer and they say, well, the law says, and the Japanese judge just looks at him and said, why do I care about the law? I am the law. And so he'll make his judgment and that sticks. You can't go and appeal the judgment. Now, there's no such a thing as appealing a court decision in Asia because the judge is the moral definer. It doesn't matter what it says in writing. It's what the situational morality, the right thing to do in that situation was. Now, key thing in Chinese side, and this is true of most clan societies, certainly true in Hawaiian society, certainly true of what I grew up in. Clan society is one of the downsides of clans. And if you think about it, it makes sense. If my clan is descended from snakes, and another clan is descended from owls, and another clan is descended from sharks, that means our ancestors were different types of beings. They were living in the same universe together, but they were different. And therefore their children are different, i.e. the clans are different. So therefore, if you think about it, if I'm from a clan of lizard, snake, a mole, I don't have any perceived relationship to folks that are descended from owls. Why would I? They're different. In the same way that human beings don't see themselves as, in an American society, don't see themselves as actually, sort of morally, ethically related to things like chickens. We eat them all the time. So in that context, the downside of clans is that clan replaces the idea of species, if you would. There's no such idea of human beings. So there's clans, and each clan is its own pocket unit. In Asian societies, and this is true again, this is also was traditionally true in an Hawaiian society, moral ethical rules applied to the clan. In Asian societies, people have no sense of humor about people messing with morality inside of the family. That is absolutely anathema, and they come down on it like a lightning bolt from heaven. On the other hand, if you're dealing with folks who are not part of the clan, then moral rules don't apply. Now, what rules do apply is you're being worried about things like gossip. So, you might treat folks who aren't relatives well because you want them to go on TikTok or Instagram and say, oh, these guys are really nice, because then you score points, like the guy doing the calligraphy. But you're doing it by choice. There's no sense that when you die, there's going to be some sort of guy, doing a judgment, measuring like Thoth did in the Egyptian system, measuring your goods and your bad behavior, and then decide if you go to heaven or hell. Because, in the Chinese system, heaven and hell is defined by clan. It's not defined by the human species. So what this means is when you're dealing with people outside of the family, you're always going to be very careful and very, not necessarily, well, yeah, I guess suspicious isn't a bad way to phrase it, because you're aware that not only do you not have to follow moral rules in dealing with them because they're not family, but they don't have to follow moral rules in dealing with you because you're not family. So, for example, they can lie through their teeth to you and be totally comfortable. There's going to be no consequence to that action as long as they don't get caught. They might steal from you with no consequence to action because they're not going to get caught. There's no idea that they're doing something wrong. Wrong is defined by what group you're a part of. I think Americans more so, Europeans come from more complicated systems, and many Europeans come from clans. So I think they're much more aware of that consequence. But I think Americans have this really naive view that the rest of the world operates under a legal system, and it's a universal legal code. And boy, that's one reason why Americans, and someone whose family is involved in the tourism industry, that's one reason why tourists get into so much trouble, because almost no one else on the planet has the concept of a legal code. I would argue in many cases they're actually more moral than Americans are. But it's situational morality, and morality defined by the person that's actually involved in the situation, not some sort of, code of universal behavior. And so what you do is people get measured in terms of, when you're even talking about families you don't know, you'll talk about the members of the family in terms of how they're functioning vis-a-vis their other family members. So, for example, a huge source of gossip in some place like Hong Kong, which is what I'm most familiar with, is that so-and-so stole stuff from what was it, a couple of years ago? Oh, yeah. Went and embezzled from his family's company. It was the oldest son. And it was all over the newspapers, but even more importantly, all the social media can talk about nothing for a couple of weeks. Because what that was, it was a total breach of xiao, of filial piety. The oldest son has to obey the parents, has to support the parents, has to do that. Now, the interesting thing is the son was not only dissed because he did it, but the parents were equally dissed, even though they're the ones that suffered, because they must have brought him up wrong, or else he would have never done that in the first place. So everyone paid the price for that behavior in the family. So, and that's and when people are gossiping about that or talking about that, that's also so that people in your family will hear how the outrage works, so that they won't be thinking about doing something like that also. They'll see the consequences of the action. So it's important to remember that I would argue that Chinese are at least as moral, if not more moral, than Americans are. But it's based on an entirely different set of rules, and the two set of rules don't coexist very well. I'm not even sure if they coexist at all, to be honest, but they don't coexist very well. And I don't know how many times I've been drawn into the middle of both. He's on both sides. I find both of them to be really problematic if you get stuck. Anyways, what you do find is filial piety is absolutely key. Have to respect authority, have to respect seniors, especially lineage seniors. Have to take care of old members of the family, et cetera, et cetera. There's one reason why very rarely, in fact, in all of Asia, but especially in Chinese society, very rarely will see people in old folks' homes. I like where my sister works. She works in a retirement home in Eugene, Oregon. And, she points out that most of the folks there never see their relatives show up maybe once or twice a year. I mean, I suppose, so I don't know who's paying for the place, but anyways, but they're not there. Um, in the Chinese system, having someone in an old folks' home would mean immediately that if you're anybody, if the family's of any importance, everyone's going to hear about that. Because my God, what are you doing? How come you're not taking care of the parents? Yeah, they might be a hassle. Yeah, you might have to have a housekeeper to take care of them in the house, but they should be at home with you because that's the way it's supposed to be because they're your parents. And that's the Chinese just see that as a fixed. That's not even a negotiable. That's a given. You take care of family, and you take care of family in the family. Think of that family compound. It never gets out so that the outside world can see about it, talk about it, gossip about it. The idea of D or brotherly love, I've already talked about that. That's this whole idea that respect and social relationship, especially generation to generation, are incredibly tight. And also there's the respect and authority given to older generations, and the idea of sort of, uncle-like supervision of younger generations. That's, this whole idea of the structure of the extended family. It's not in Chinese society, you have to be people don't take it very well if you like some of your nephews and nieces more than others. Um, they're all supposed to be treated sort of the same because they're all the younger generation. Now, people play favorites, but you can diss them on that because they know they're not supposed to. So, the idea that you not only know all your brothers and sisters, but also all your cousins, et cetera, and they have close relationships is an expectation of everyone involved in Chinese society. People don't own things as individuals. Now, someone might do very well and have a really nice house and stuff like that. But when push comes to shove, they're expected if they have to take in other family members. If someone's car breaks down, and especially if there's someone senior, if the oldest brother's car breaks down, then one of the other brothers will offer his, car to replace it. There's no sense. Individuals don't possess things. Individuals possess things to show the success that they've made of themselves, and by extension, the success of the family. But stuff moves around all the time, and this is one reason why Chinese and Hawaiians intermarried so much when the Chinese moved over to Hawaii in the 19th century, is because a lot of the values and stuff are very, very similar. They're not the same, but they're so similar as to make the adjustment pretty small. By contrast, I know a couple of folks that were, Americans, Anglo-Americans married into Asian families, both Korean and Chinese. And in two cases, the divorces happened because they could not get used to the fact that they were the one working hard. They bought this car, they bought this, whatever it was. It's so, whatever it is. And all of a sudden it's gone because someone else in the family wanted it. And they get all unhinged because it's like, well, that was my money, my work paid for that. And it's like, it's mine, with very much in big caps. Chinese society doesn't see mine, it's ours. And yeah, it's, yeah, yeah. If you ever want to see a relationship go south in a hurry, I would argue that in a lot of cases, that's probably the number one thing there. The number two would be women marrying into Asian, especially Chinese, and I'd say Korean, and even Japanese families, but certainly Chinese and Korean, and realizing that they're always going to be second class citizens because they're the in-laws. But yeah, individual possessions, boy, that's Chinese and Anglo-Americans have absolutely no common ground on that. Now it's funny because you'll see Chinese love to buy expensive shit. I mean, you go to Hong Kong, and I think they've got the world's number one. Well, it's probably Shanghai now, but the top Versace store, the top Bottega store. You're going to find Chinese love to have expensive stuff. And we were actually talking to a girl in this cheap little ass noodle shop in Hong Kong, downtown Hong Kong. And she was so proud of the fact, she was just she was just serving us and going on break. And she had a Gucci bag. And my wife's first attitude is it's a fake, since fakes are real common. And she was all offended. She said, "Oh, no, this is real." Actually, no, no, no. She showed us there's ways to find out if it's real. And I'm not going to get into that, but anyways, it was. She had nothing but, noodles and basically near starvation for 6 months to buy that bag. Now, in the American context, you buy that bag because you want people to impress with you. She bought that bag because she wanted to be impressed. She wanted people to be impressed with who she was, but she also wanted her family to gain a little prestige, even though she worked in a cheap noodle shop. That somehow she could afford this bag, because she knew that that knew the family would see her with the bag. So it didn't stop at the level of the individual. She was actually enhancing family prestige. And I think we went there a couple of weeks there. She didn't have the bag anymore. She gave it to her sister. Totally an American thing to do. So yeah, family is always more important than the individual. Now, like I said, the guy doing the calligraphy, what that also the family's expectations are is members of the family are expected to do as good as they can at what they're best at. Not necessarily making money, not necessarily whatever, but they're supposed to be as good as they can be because that's what the family's going to score points with. Now, as I mentioned before, the reverse is true. The family is always responsible for all the behavior of all the members of the family. Now, what this means is folks that are good, like that guy doing the calligraphy, is I'm sure people know who he is, and I'm sure that's gotten around. So he is an upstanding, very well educated, and Chinese spend an enormous amount of prestige and effort on education, unlike Americans. Being educated in China can mean things like, poetry and calligraphy, which, to be honest, I think in the United States, no one would give a squat about. So education in China is a very different commodity than sort of the very commercialized education you see in the United States. So he's well educated. The family gains points because of that. Now, what that also means is other members of the family that might not be particularly good at anything, or maybe they never found anything to be particularly good at. As long as they keep their heads low, obey the other members of the family, respect everyone, and follow the rules, and don't cause any trouble, they can coast really isn't accurate, but they're just going to be sort of non-entities. But that's okay. This guy, the calligraphy guy, isn't going to get pissed off because his brother has just never been good at anything. He's still his brother. He's still a part of the family. That's good. That's fine. So there's no idea that everyone is going to be something spectacular, but you can't mess the group up. Because the group's always responsible for everyone in the group. You can't suddenly say, "Oh, wait," you can't disown a member of the family. I'm pretty sure that's not even legally possible in China. Now, a lot of this we've already gone through. The roles of men and the roles of women are radically different in Chinese society. Now they're changing a lot. Though again, it's hard to see. Changes in Chinese society in the last 30 years have really gone sort of in a yo-yo. For a while back in the 90s, 2000s, women were moving into positions of authority. In fact, even today, there's more women in authority in China than there is in the United States, ironically. Senior business partners, senior members of government, much more so than the United States, for all the rhetoric of gender equality. Having said that, women traditionally had very limited options. And if you think about it, we've gone through enough of the gender thing, that's sure obvious why. And to a certain extent, even today, even though women are highly successful in a lot of areas in China, I certainly see this in land-laws, is again, as I mentioned before, you sort of take on, you don't become a guy, but you take on sort of male type behaviors So for example, the in-law, my female in-laws who are very successful in the family there's no doubt, they're oftentimes called rather ironically dragon ladies, but there's no doubt that they are good. There's no doubt they have to try harder to be good than their male counterparts, but they are good at what they do. And everyone knows that, everyone respects it. They're not looked down on the fact that they're women. If anything, they're given more points because they've actually succeeded, even though they are women. And I think this is probably, again, Chinese are incredibly pragmatic. And if a woman's got a good business sense, then the family's not going to be stupid enough to say, "Oh, you're a girl, you can't do that." That would people just slap them up the side of the head. Got to make the best use of all your family members you can. So, having said that, there's still sort of in the background of a lot of this the idea that, and in fact, you see this a lot right now. The Communist Party rhetoric in the last 4 or 5 years is to sort of like, put men back in the driver's seat, which for the life of me, I don't, who knows what the hell that's about. But I've given up trying to figure out what the current Communist Party logic is. And that's getting a lot of pushback from women in authority in China. They're sort of like, we ain't putting guys back in charge. So it's an interesting situation. I think the Japanese are sort of slightly, sort of easing towards that. If you're aware, the current new prime minister in Japan is a woman. And she's, well, little I've seen of her, at least in her speeches and stuff, she seems like she's got her shit together. So I think more and more you're finding that the Japanese, by virtue of necessity, are sort of, coming to the same sort of conclusion. But Japanese, as we'll see later, ideologically, Japanese have never let pragmatism or practicality get in the way of ideology. Chinese have never let ideology get in the way of practicality. Chinese are invariably the most pragmatic, practical population I've ever seen on the planet. So if a woman can do something better, then she's going to end up in it, but she won't be taking on women's roles. So, for example, women in large positions of authority, I can't think of too many of them that I'm aware of that actually have raised families and have a husband. It's sort of like what they do is they take on sort of a male role. And that's the choice that I think a lot of really successful women take. And it says something that Chinese women do that, I think, in a fairly strong concept that that's how it's going to be. Okay, let's see if I can finish through this without taking up too much time. Marriage. Marriages are really interesting because, again, if you think about Chinese marriages are company mergers. You're marrying a family that you don't know anything about, that you don't really trust because they're not part of the clan, otherwise it would be incest. And so therefore, you have to test the waters. Because again, you have to remember in Asian societies, there is no concept of divorce traditionally. In fact, even still today, it's very, very rare. So you marry, whoever you marry, you're stuck with them. And the two families are, more importantly, the two families are stuck with each other. Now, what you find, and this is still a hugely important thing. In fact, from what I understand, this was always true. I have no reason to be on Chinese dating sites, but I know Chinese dating sites, last time I looked at one about 8 years ago, first thing they ask is once you register your name. The next thing you do is you put in the 4 characters, the year that you were born, the month that you were born, the day that you were born, the hour that you were born. Now, Chinese all know this. Koreans know this too. Japanese always know the day, month, year. But Japanese don't seem to pay much attention to the hour for some reason. Anyways, in Chinese society, numerology, numbers are considered really important diagnostic traits of both behavior and also future potential. So numerology is really important. It looks similar to the classic sort of American concept of your zodiac or sign or whatever they want to call it, but it's not. It's entirely different set of concepts. So that means if a boy's going to date a girl, this is why the dating sites do this right off the top. If a guy goes into the dating site and he's going to look for a date, first criteria that's going to be used by the dating site, by the software, is that the four characters that he has, year, month, day, and hour, are going to be matched or compatible ones with the girl. Otherwise, they're not going to even let them date. Doesn't matter how cute she is or whether they're same interest or whatever. They're just going to say, no, it's incompatible. This is the first criteria. So in a classic situation, I know this is true when I first met my wife, is that one of the first things they sort of innocently ask you is like, oh, when were you born? And he's, like for the American sense, like chronologically, how old are you? And it's like, no, when were you born? So it's the month and the day. No, when were you born? They want to know what hour you were born. In Asia, when you get your birth certificate, from the hospital, they actually have a lady with a stopwatch, and she'll actually get it down to the minute when you popped out of your mom. And the reason is all of that is seen to give indications of what your potential is. What's your behavior is likely to be, not that it's not fixed, but what your potential is. And what you don't want is men and women's potentials to be in competition or conflict. So you get through this first before you go out on a date or even talk to someone semi-seriously, the sense of having an extended conversation. Now, what you also then do is if the family's not, most families have someone in the family who does this internally. But if they don't, they'll actually go to someone who is a diviner, if you want to call them. And they'll actually go, here's the numbers, is this going to be a good potential match? They'll run it through their logic system and say yes or no. And you can go to Chinatown. In fact, on Amazon, you can actually find English text that actually will give you all this stuff. This is the first thing people do. Now, in marriage, virginity is important. Now, if you think about this, this makes perfect sense because women are moving into the husband's clan. In a pragmatic way, their job is to provide sons to the clan. They need to know where the sons are coming from, i.e. from the husband. So the idea that the woman is a virgin is important not for religious reasons or not even moral reasons. It's important for, it's not whether she's a good girl or a bad girl. It's that you need, from a very practical standpoint, once the sons are born into the family, they're the family. There's nothing, you can't disown them, you can't get rid of them, you can't say, oh, it was a mistake, whatever. They're there. So you've got to make sure that they're your kids. And it also is important in the Chinese system because it implies that the girl was willing to withhold from certain behaviors till she commits herself to this family. So this idea, the commitment of the outsider to the family of important side of the clan. Now, what you do find traditionally is that the husband, the potential husband, the boy's family, will give a substantial amount of gifts to the girl's family at the point of engagement. And the reason is you don't break off engagements. If someone, by the time they've got engaged in China, they're getting married, unless some sort of huge thing happens. But again, that would be an absolute disaster if an engagement is broken off. That's a total disaster for both families. So everyone in both families is going to try to make sure that doesn't happen. What that also means is everyone in both families is going to make really sure this is a good idea before the engagement happens. And one of the ways you do that is you make sure that the groom's side of the family is willing collectively, not him individually, is willing to collectively ante up goods, money, whatever, to the girl's side of the family, to the spouse's side of the family. Because this means the commitment's going to last. It also means that what happens is once the engagements occur, that the bride's side of the bride will actually start spending a lot of time with her husband's family or the groom's family. And this is a sense of like a final compatibility test. I suppose if everyone starts chasing each other around the house with knives or something like that, they might break it off. But theoretically, it should have never gotten that far. So in fact, what you frequently find is the bride-to-be will spend a large amount of time with the groom-to-be's family prior to the engagement as part of this minefield to make sure that nothing gets screwed up. Chinese marriages are incredibly ritualized. Um, I can't get over how ritualized they are. Everything is structured. There's nothing left to chance. There's no variety. There's no, hey, let's do this to be different. It's about as different from an American marriage as you can possibly imagine. Um, and it's always done the same way. Chinese are totally fixated on the fact that nothing, absolutely nothing can go wrong. So everything has to work the right way, which is one reason why being ritualized and very formal makes sense. If it's very ritualized, it's very formal, it's always the same, then no one's going to make any mistakes. No one's going to screw it up. Because in the Chinese system, if a marriage gets screwed up, even some minor way, if they're walking down the aisle and the bride trips, for example, both families would be firmly convinced that marriage is going to be a disaster. So the marriage ceremony itself, and the ceremony actually takes a couple of days. It's not a one-day thing. The marriage ceremony itself is incredibly structured. And again, it's a public performance for two families to show off in public. So it has to be done right. So people spend a lot of time, a lot of money, and a huge amount of emotional and social stress making a marriage happen. And everyone gets involved. Marriages are invariably two clan affairs. And yeah, there's something. What you do is before this happens, obviously before the engagement, especially after the engagement, you go back to one of these diviners, or oftentimes the what's called fortune tellers, but that's sort of a bad term because it implies a level of sloppiness. And these people are very professional. They will actually tell you everything about how the marriage is going to be set up. Not only when it's going to be, where it's going to be, where everyone shows up at, who enters where, who enters what, who says what. This is one of the main things they do is they make sure it's the diviner's job to make sure that the marriage doesn't get screwed up. Because the family's not going to, I mean, families have always go through these marriages, obviously, but these marriages are so ritualized and so complex is people can figure out when something didn't go right. Because I was at one marriage where it did get screwed up a little bit. And immediately, even I could figure out that's not the way it's supposed to happen. But that's because when you see it all the other times, it always happens the same way. So the job of the diviner, one of the main jobs, is to make sure that everything occurs the way it's supposed to be. At the wedding or at the marriage ceremony, the girl brings a large dowry, money, stuff, whatever it might be. And that's to prove to the living members of the family, especially Zhejiang, but also to the ancestors, who, of course, are watching all this, because you have to remember the ancestors are not somewhere else. They're not in a heaven or a hell. They're there watching this thing. And there's a very strong sense that the ancestors are a major region for the marriage being right. Don't want to piss off the ancestors. And so when the girl's giving the dowry and the girl's family is giving this stuff, it's to PR the living members of the family, but also PR the ancestors. The ancestors will support, sponsor, and give their blessings to this marriage and the future. End result is it costs more for the groom's family at the start, but the net result is the wife's family not only gives up a dowry, which is more than what the groom's family gave over, but they also lose the girl. And in modern Chinese families where women there's a shortage of women, she was probably the one taking care of the parents, keeping care of the house, might have been running the business. So families are going to think right now, families are thinking very seriously, unless she's got some really burning reason that she wants to get married to this guy, families are not going to be totally stoked on it. Now, of course, guys desperately want their son to marry. So, China's gotten pretty surreal in terms of how this all plays out. But one of the interesting side effects of this is, if anything, I would argue marriages seem to be getting more ritualized. Because if anything, the bride and her family have more input into how this should happen versus traditionally where it was pretty much driven by the groom or the husband's family. Okay, let's finish. Yeah, we need to finish with this. First, Sons aren't considered the head of the family until the father's dead. The father might be, totally, Alzheimer's might be living in a box somewhere, something. I don't know. Doesn't make any difference. As long as he's actually alive, the sons are only doing stuff for him. The oldest son takes over in everything but name, oftentimes from a young age. I know one guy who was already running the family by the time he was in his 30s. His dad was only in his late 50s. But the dad was never particularly mature. He was a classic, let's go to Vegas and party guy. And so the son was basically running the family from I'd say probably from when he was a teenager. But nonetheless, he's never going to be head of family until the father passes. Now, what you do find, and this again goes back to the idea of everyone contributing, is if the oldest son isn't particularly strong, if the oldest son isn't particularly good at running everything, emotionally, cognitively, whatever, what you're going to find is the other sons will step up to bat. So the second or third son might take on a lot of what would normally be the oldest son's responsibility. So again, this idea of sharing among siblings, again, this generational thing, is really, 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 really common. And siblings are always expected to work together. They never work at cross purposes. That's not to say they don't, but they got to be very careful about that, because if outsiders find out, well, that's a huge source of gossip. Chinese love to tell stink about a family where brothers are going after each other, brothers and sisters aren't. In Hawaii, the Fongs are a classic case in point. Everyone still talks about how the brothers were suing each other. At least in many cases, at least a lot of the stories, it's actually not the sons, it's their wives. Again, this classic idea of the women marrying into the family causing the trouble. So I mean, it's not that it doesn't happen; it happens all the time. But the amount of negative publicity, if you would, gossip and feedback and stuff, is absolutely stunning. So siblings help siblings. Siblings work together for a common goal. Might not be happy about it, but again, got to step up to the plate. The oldest son will generally take over or manage the family's properties or businesses, but they're expected to dole that out to other members, the other siblings. And then, that sort of makes sense from a practical standpoint. Different people have different skills. And again, this idea that you can always assume, and I think Chinese would always assume, that people will always do what's good for the family first. So, giving your brother control of part of the business, he's not going to go off and sell that to some, venture capitalist firm and screw the family over because he wants to go live in Monaco for the rest of his life. That no way that would be acceptable. No way it would happen, I don't think. Now, having said that, also what you then find is each brother, if they're married, if they're older and they're married, each household is actually a separate unit. Now, it gets sort of complicated. That separate is maybe I should call it a relative term here. In most cases, they do their own thing. In anything where the family is a larger unit has to get together, then the family gets together. So it's not like people lose their individuality. It's just in an entirely different context. The key part is individuality isn't the center of which the universe revolves around, which I would argue is true in American society. It's not true. Chinese identify as individuals, but they also identify themselves as part of a group, and they're very proud of it. That's one reason why Chinese invariably use their last names. I've worked with the guys for like 15, 20 years. I have no idea what their first name is. I know they have one, and I wouldn't know it, and they wouldn't know mine, and neither of us would care. You're part of a group, and you don't lose your sense of personal identity just because you're part of a group any more than people on a football team are part of a group. Death is very expensive. And again, the reason for that is that when someone passes in the family, that has to be presented in a way that the outside world is going to see, one, how much the family misses that individual because they're now dead. And secondly, how much the way resources the family has that they can use that as a conspicuous consumption for this person that's going through a ceremony of passing. Now, what you frequently find, you don't see this much anymore. I remember we went to a guy that we met in Xi'an. His family actually lives in a village outside of Xi'an. And he wanted us to go see them to sort of see how the old style lived. And I had heard of these, but I had never seen one until then. It's the only one I've seen, but I've never been in rural areas before. You go in the main hallway. So it's a family compound. There's 3 families in the compound. The oldest senior family member is in the center part of the compound. And right there against the back wall, when you came in the front doors, was a coffin. That was the coffin for the Xiaoshang. That was his coffin that he was going to be put in when he passed away. Now, the guy was only in his 50s. And he wasn't, he was healthy. But having an expensive coffin, since that costs a lot, is what you do is you actually buy it like you buy a car. You buy it and you make payments on it with the idea that when you eventually pass, then that's a cost that's already been set aside. So the family's not going to take a hit having to provide, a box to stuff you in. One of the other traditional and rather brutal side effects that was true in most societies, certainly true here in Hawaii, but certainly true all throughout East Asia, is no one's actually given a real name until they're a year old. Infant mortality was stunningly high in Asia, as it was in the Pacific. Huge proportion of the population passes away from birth to 1 year of age. In a rather practical way, families couldn't afford, traditional Chinese families, I think is for two kids to reach the age of 5 kids would die before they were a year old. There's no way families could afford that expense. So until you were a year old, you weren't really a real family member. You were sort of maybe part-time family member. And this horrified European, especially European missionaries who were going to China, trying to spin the Chinese as being, these primitive savages, stuff like that. So what they would do is they'd be horrified at the fact that Chinese would very casually sort of bury infants. Now, the interesting thing is the same thing happened in Europe right up until the late Middle Ages for the same reason, infant mortality. In fact, right into the 1800s. So, it's not unique, but nonetheless, Europeans in the 19th and 20th century and Americans were very big on how brutally callous the Chinese were about the way they treated kids. It's even more true in Korean society for a bunch of different reasons. But the reality was just sort of practical. You celebrated the first, and this is still something Chinese do. When you get a year old, you're given your formal name. Now you already have your first name and obviously your family name, but your middle names will be given to you when you're 1 year old by the senior member of the family or some senior member, maybe not the cha-chong, but someone, oftentimes a senior woman, come to think of it, will give you your sort of a very poetic middle name. And at that point, now you're a formal family member. And now at that point, if anything happens to you, it's a whole 9-yard ceremony attached to it. So a very interesting attitude and a very practical attitude about the idea of when you become a member of the family. Okay, so I think that sort of finishes this off.